Hey guys, this is Mikro. I'm making another tier list video based off the most recent, well, not patch, but some, from the new year forward and around the time of New Year's, not including the exploit where you could use the secondary weapons passives on one weapon, which completely invalidates this tier list completely, but it seems like most companies are just making that taboo to do that. So and which is right. But yeah, so I'm not gonna judge it based off of that. But if you were to judge off of that, there would be some crazy combos that you can pull off of in a tier list where that would be possible. But basically, this meta has kind of had a dichotomy with you having a completely different meta than NA. And the meta that you run completely is built off of if the other team has more kill squad people or if they have a more ball people. By that I mean usually a roster has roster has 50 players. In NA, it's very common. Well, not every company in NA, but for some companies in NA, they run 15 decks, and if you run 15 decks, then there are better weapons for certain situations than if you're running against like a EU oriented comp that has 5 decks. It, where basically there are things that help you live versus decks become better, which sounds obvious, but it basically just comes down to healers. Like the reason why I don't have either one of these builds in S tier is it basically depends on your meta which one's better. But I think without there being Kill Squad in your backline, uh, Ice Gauntlet is better. But if there is Kill Squad in your backline, then Hatchet is better right now for healer, and it's a little bit situational based off the army that you're facing. And Hatchet has kind of come out as being better than Rapier in most builds, including in other roles besides healer. So like if you were gonna run Spear Rapier, like I would definitely try out Spear Hatchet. I'm just not putting it on here because I haven't seen it yet, but I think Hatchet is generally better than Rapier at this point in the game. So hopping into like the list of things, this is gonna be in general off metas I've seen. Kill Squad, this build doesn't really exist in EU from what I've seen. EU only runs bow hatchets, which I still think is good. But BBIG I think is best anti-kill squad tool still, and then Greatsword Great Axe is still the best kill squad build in the game. The EU also runs Great Axe, or I didn't put it in here. I put it in a where did I put the Great Sword? That should be on here. One sec. Let me add this in. Uh, Greatsword Hatchet should be in Kill Squad. It's like sort of a hybrid between a Bruiser and a Kill Squad, but I think it's more Kill Squad oriented than Bruiser oriented. But Greatsword Hatchet has turned out to be like a pretty popular build in uh, EU. I don't think it has taken any ground in NA. I think it has a decent amount of benefits, but also has some like drawbacks. Basically, the idea behind this build is you just don't insta die with the great sword, but the problem is your maneuverability is severely like weakened, and then you're kind of stuck in clumps. But in those clumps, you have lots of dodges because 150 decks, so you have like 4 to 5 dodges, which is great, but you can't actually close the distance. So this like build severely struggles to decks in particular. It severely struggles to musket and bow, but it is better versus BBs. So it's like this is like a meta dependent build. In NA, I don't think this build works at all because if you run this build, you're just gonna get shot and you're not gonna be able to really run anywhere. Which is why in NA, Greatsword, Great Axe is better. Like you take more damage when you're in this, but your ability to kite very fast and go in very fast is better with this build, which is why it's more popular in NA. BBIG is popular in both reasons in both regions. It just is able to deal with a lot of these kill squad builds very well, as well as pressure main clump. So there's and healers. So there's not like a reason not like BBIG in the kill squad. Bow, hatchet's like a thing that's EU started running. I think NA is running a little bit of now. NA is mostly musket bow. But bow hatchet's like a build where you can lower your con and then you can get away with that because you have the hatchet for defy death, which is good versus range players, but doesn't work as well versus like VGs. But bow doesn't usually have a VG on you, so hatchet works well as a extra life for the most part. And Hatchet has basically taken off as being very good, just because of social distancing, and the amount of distance this actually moves you back is like enough to get you into cover in most situations. I don't know if they actually run like all the perks in here. Like I could see someone running like rejuvenating crits just for more stam every time you throw one of these abilities, but this is generally what people run. I've seen some people run rending throw, not because it's better than infected throw, but because the animation's shorter. So that's like a conversation as well. But I think infected throw, if you can run it, is strictly better than rending throw in almost every situation. So that's where bow hatchet I think stands. Great sword SNS is very good as a one of. It's not as like a like if you have it as a one of, it's like one of the best builds just to have. Basically, because you're giving your kill squad leadership, and you have really good pressure with that build. So not a lot to not like about that. And I would say as a one of, it is better than most of these builds on this list in a kill in specifically in a kill group that can support it. But if you're not in a kill group that can't support it, then it's like not as good. Bow Greatsword is still like good, but Hatchet seems to be a better Greatsword in most circumstances at this point because it like lets you lower your con a little bit and increase your damage to your primary. And people were playing Greatsword as a secondary, not as a primary. So if you're not able to like kind of juggle both, it's not as good. And then Musket Rapier, Bow Rapier has seemingly fallen off from Hatchet. And then all these other builds are basically just not seeing play in a kill squad. IGVG is like the closest to seeing play, but I wouldn't say it's really seeing play because you have to use too many cooldowns to get in, and then you just get stuck in and you can't get out. Bruiser wise, this is basically the same. Great Axe Warhammer is just dominant over Greatsword, mostly just because Greatsword just takes too long to use abilities. If you are going to use like a Greatsword in a kill group, then I would. This is not the right tree for that. This is a kill squad greatsword setup that in the way that EU runs it. They I think you could run Roaring Rupture or you could run Steadfast Strike. Both these are good. Steadfast Strike is like more kill squad oriented. Roaring Rupture is more of the I'm sort of in a clump, but not really in a clump, like near the edge where a BBIG would play, which is like how their build kind of functions. It's like very similar to BBIG in terms of like range. So which is why I don't think it's like a direct kill squad build, but it's like a zone control build, if you will, which is like the same reason why BBIG is slotted. I could do this on the spot probably, but if you were gonna do this for like a normal greatsword group, like as a kill kind of weapon, then you would have something like this. It's pretty much the same as the other tree, just you actually, no, this is the same as the other tree. But yeah, you run something like this. If you wanted to make it more defensive, and you didn't, and you're like worried about going into clumps, then I would cut Skyward Slash. I would go into Steadfast, and I would just like swap those over. It's not many swaps, so it's like you switch your ult and you switch this. The Calamity Counters build is not bad, but it's not as good. Because as like I originally thought, because the rend is kind of inconsistent when it procs and it has to be versus melee in particular. So like if you're against a melee setup, then if you have like a soft tech, like if you go like this, then this could work decently well. But if you're not versus or like something like this, if you're versus more ranged, so it's like one of those setups is like what you're looking for the greatsword. But from testing, all of them feel generally weaker than Great Axe because your pressure is less and you're giving up that pressure for utility, but your utility isn't that insane. If you're an onslaught, you have more pressure, but then you take more damage, so you just die to BBIGs, which is why EU had this thing in the first place where it's like, oh, we're gonna go medium, we're gonna go great sword with hatchet, so we can live. But then you don't have the same kill pressure as a great axe, so it's like it's kind of a weird balance. And in clumps, if you're an onslaught, you're just gonna get farmed 90% of the time. So you have to either find a spot where you're not taking damage and go into onslaught, or you'll just do less damage than a great axe in general in a clump. So it's a little weird. I guess the benefit to Calamity Counter is like it's a little bit better if people are running into you than something like Blast Shot, I guess, or Clear Out. But at that point, you're like comparing it to something that's like more niche. It's good at making people like move off of you, and it's good at supporting your bruisers, but it would not be like a main kill squad thing. It would be like a maybe run one IG VG in your group, and then you have one of these, and then you have two Great X. But it would not be the main build in that, which is why I've rated it a little bit lower. I think Stoneform Bruisers are still better than Detonate, but there are circumstances where I've seen Detonate get value, but it's generally for an army, Stoneform is better than Detonate, but there are times where Detonate can force a lot of stuff and get a lot of value. It's just more niche than it used to be. Mostly a defensive tool, which I'm jumping to the end here a little bit, but Detonate's a little bit better than defense on offense because it's easier to hit. But there are times where you can't hit it on offense. It seems like sort of bruiser dependent, and you have to like look at VODs because people will either, it seems like they'll either hit 0 detonates in a war and then it will do nothing. And it's like, okay, why don't you just have Stoneform and it would have been very consistent, or they'll hit like a few that are like fight winning, like point winning detonates. So it just depends on the bruiser pretty much between these two. At Greatsword Warhammer is, I think, the only other build I really consider to be a bruiser build that's like popular. Maybe if you consider the Hatchet build as a bruiser build, but it doesn't really play like a bruiser build. It plays as a zone control build, which I'd say is like BBIG, but it has a little bit less pressure. And it doesn't counter as many builds. Like a BBIG can do a bow hatchet and like win that duel. A Greatsword Hatchet, I don't think it ever win a duel versus bow hatchet because the bow hatchet will just create too much distance, and a Greatsword Hatchet won't be able to close the distance. As well as a Greatsword Hatchet has to like commit to stuff to get value, and the BBIG can just stand there and shoot and kite. So inherently, I think that makes BBIG a little bit better, but Greatsword Hatchet has some merit. Moving on to support builds. Okay, so I put the Greatsword Hatchet in here too. So yeah, it's like it's a weird build. You have to like watch these VODs, but it it is like a hybrid between a kill squad and a bruiser. The reason why I originally put this in support is because people run infected throw with it, and then the way that they run the greatsword has the sickening slash. So basically, this is just a build that is very similar to how Void Gauntlet functions in the sense that you could put one person on disease cap and run cap very easily. So it is like a pseudo support build as well. So it has like more utility than BBIG. It just has like less pressure, I guess. But it, unless you're like on top of the person, like it closes distance worse, but it has good pressure. So I don't know. EU loves this build, so I think if you're running this build, you don't really have a problem. But it is like one of those builds that I talked about earlier. That's like a you run one IGVG and you run one of these, but you have to run the IGVG still because the Oblivion counters this build, and Wood Gauntlet's just too good to not run an IGVG. So it's like you have that like one flex spot in each group where you could run like a BBIG, you could run this build maybe, you could run a Great Axe, you can run another melee if you wanted to. That's like kind of army dependent and strength dependent. But on supports in general, IGVG is best. You'll always slot this in a group. IGBB is situationally good. Greatsword Hatchet is situationally good. If you wanted to do something like Greatsword Warhammer, that could be situationally good, but I would consider that to be more of a bruiser than a support. But it will function very similarly. The benefit of running something like a Greatsword Warhammer is if you run it like a let me go back to this other setup. If you drop the Calamity counter and then you run something like this and you get rid of the block passive, because the block stuff doesn't really work as well as I originally thought. It's just a little bit too situational, but the bleed does give you ult very fast, so but it also makes it so that you literally knock people out of clumps sometimes. So it's like I think you can get value out of this potentially if you're good with it, but generally not worth it. But this is like more standard. The basic combo here would be okay, I close the distance with Steadfast Strike, and then I do like a light attack so they can't run away because then the healer can't dodge, and then I do a heavy attack with Aggressive Shift, which will put me in an Aggressive Shift, and then I go Relentless Rush, which will root them, and then I pull them in and Throwing Rupture, and then I swap to Warhammer and do my thing. Like that's a pretty standard combo with this build. That's how you would be running that, and it's like a really good to follow up on top of Great X Pressure because it can just close the distance very well, but generally it's not as good as a standalone build. It's more of a secondary build. You follow up on people like you are support, but you still have like the output of melees, more traditional melees with great axes. So that's where that kind of stands. BBVG as a support, still good, but this kind of struggles versus some of the pressure builds I've seen. So it's like as a support, it's a little bit iffier, I think, in medium or in light than this as a tank. And as a tank, it's good. EU used to run these builds all the time as a tank, but then they've recently cut them. I'm not exactly sure why. I know EU is also running the Great Sword Warhammer stuff, and they've recently cut them as well because it's just less util than some of the other builds you could slot in that, which I'll talk about in a second. If you're running Pylon as a support, I think you're generally doing it wrong because you have more int as a support, so it makes more sense to run the Storm for your ult charge than as a tank versus as a tank. Pylon's better because then you don't overlap these, as well as we're kind of entering a spot where healers are starting to run a lot of ice gauntlets, and generally they're running Pylon as well because they don't do any damage with their Storm, so they don't want to override people. So that's like an interesting spot where do you run Pylon here, or do you run do you run Storm? When I'm not exactly sure with that, but Pylon for tank is very good because it gets you ult charged insanely fast because you have more con generally, you have more heavy armor, which influences off like some of those perks that will give you more health. And then your pylon is able to do more. Your pylon's on center of point usually, so if it does not die, usually it will, but there are times where it does not, or you'll put it off point to peel for healers. And if you have the pylon burst, then that's like an AoE that's just constantly giving you ult charge. It's basically the fastest. This is the fastest build. That they're two builds that are insanely fast at building ults. IGVG is insanely fast at building ults, and IGBB is insanely fast at building ults. I think both are. I think IGVG is a little bit faster, but IGBB is very very close, especially with pylon. So it's and then those pad builds where you're charging, where you're kind of padding more because you have the pylon matter less now because that pad turns into like an ult, and that ult and provides insane value. Like Vines is like a 20% disease, a 20% weaken, uh, or sorry, not 20% disease, it's 20% rend, 20% weaken, and a lockdown. So you have like have to use a cleanse pot for it. So if you're getting that like every 30 seconds to a minute, it's generally like insane versus if you're running something more traditional and you're getting it like every minute to a minute and a half. I would prefer people to pad more with pylon, if that makes sense. And this is like the best spot to run that build. The other really good part about pylon is it lets you get your ult the fastest off the gate. You just drop a pylon on the dummies if you're on attack or on defense, and that will give you ult charge, and it hasn't been patched, so I assume that's a game mechanic at this point. uh so yeah, you can just get ult charge off the dummies, and then you can go, and you don't even have to be there. Like in EU, they'll literally have 10 people AFK and farm ult off dummies. Versus NA is just like, okay, we'll just drop our pylons and go, and we'll get our ult before the EU guys get their ult anyway. So it doesn't really matter. Um, but yeah, pylon is very good at building ult. And that's why I think it is still the highest. BB is just the best way to live on point by far, and it's not really contestable. VGBB, I'm not exactly sure why EU isn't running these anymore. I've had a lot of success with them, but I haven't had success versus, or I haven't had wars with it versus like the best companies in NA in like a few weeks to months at this point with this build, so I can't like easily say it's like number one the best, but I could say versus 95% of companies this build's insane. And versus 5%, I'm not exactly sure at the moment. And that's about where I think Great Axe Warhammer is too. I think versus 95% of companies this is insane. Versus uh, the top 5%, it can be exploited just because you have to commit to clumps more and you don't play life as well on point. So if your ball is losing this build, is absolutely terrible. If your ball is winning this build, can basically prevent people single-handedly from escaping ever. So it's like it's a win more build. So you have to take that as you will. Like if you're losing this build's going to look awful. If you're winning this build's going to look fantastic. There's not much of an in between because it's a build that hard commits to things. So yeah, a little bit of a more risky build to run. SNSVG, I think I originally had down here like a month ago. Yeah, I had it like really far down here. That off of Recent Wars is I brought that up just basically completely because of Lengod and just because of the SNS exploit slash bug where you can use Plague Strikes and Trenchant Rend on the same weapon, and then if you swap off that weapon and swap back to it, it instant resets the cooldown, meaning that you can just single target people and put a 15% disease and 25% rend with no cooldown, which just basically makes it a better what do you call it? It's a better armor breaker in a 1v1. So it's just, and it has no cooldown basically, so it's just insane. the SNS part is also like decent value if you actually know how to use it right. The VG is just the best util based weapon that you can run as a secondary. Be curious if you ran this with BB, but SNS I think has some merit just based off that single target damage, which is something that's like lacking on point as of recent. Is with all the BBs being slotted, there's like a weird circumstance where no one could really do damage to each other. And this is one of those builds that can be like, hey, I'm also survivable, but then if I do this to you, you will just die. So that's why that build is very good and slottable. And there's other alternatives to that. The main alternative I've seen is Spear Rapier, which they are starting to run on other servers. It not just in or not in NA yet, but mostly I don't even know if EU runs them, but I know it's like starting to catch speed. The main idea with this is you run this in medium, you run the stam regenning perks, and you basically have 5 to 6 dodges in a row. So you run a bunch of Shirking Fort. On top of that, you run Fortified Perforate, you run Enfeebling Skewer. You're basically making it so that one target gets to the run cap instantly, which is like the point of the Greatsword Warhammer. But you have like your trade off is you're not as tanky, but you have more dodges. So if you get caught, you could be screwed. But then if you also have bleeds with this build, like a lot of bleed. So if you run the stone form with that and just play around your stone form, which you could proc while you are knocked down for some reason. Like, so you will just have get out of jail free cards with that, and then you abuse your dodges, and you can do very, very well. Sweep is also just an insanely low cooldown for how good it is. Like, I believe it's like an 8 or 9 second cooldown for the same util as like a Warhammer Shockwave. So it's very, very good. And the other really good part about Sweep is Freedom doesn't work against it. So it's like very strong on point where more people run Freedom generally because Shirking Fort isn't as good for point players since it doesn't really help them live as much since they're already super tanky versus that stuff. And they just die to CC combo chains, which Freedom helps versus. So it's like a soft counter to that. So I could see this build being better. At this point, I'd rate it over IGBB without Pylon and Greatsword Warhammer, but IGBB without Pylon is still a very, very solid build, and I think Greatsword Warhammer is a very solid build on most servers. Oh wait, I said this wrong earlier. Great Axe Warhammer is actually insane right now in Wars. Greatsword Warhammer is like pretty good, but it's not as insane. This is still really good in 95% of the servers. I just don't think it works versus like the top two, not even two. Like it doesn't work versus like the top like company in NA from what I've seen, but it has worked versus literally everyone else. So it's like the bar is pretty high. It is like more of a win more build. Great Axe Warhammer, if you're running this with a good bruiser, I've seen it work very well. It's just finding those bruisers is hard. But at Great Axe is obviously the highest pressure build in the game that's typically slotted, so it's very easily. It does very, very well there, surprisingly, because you're in a spot where no one can really do damage to each other, so Great Axe Warhammer just kind of farms. And also the gravel is really set up for BBs very nicely, and BBs are heavily present in point groups, so it's just a very nice build to have as like a one of in a point group. Like AoEs aren't typically slotted a ton anymore. Like there's like one to maybe two of them per team. So usually point group has 3 to 4 people, usually more towards 4. So that's where like if you run a great sword or if you run a great axe warhammer and like 3 BBs and stuff can just really start dying very, very fast. Spear Rapier is like a build that works on top of like melees and is more free roamy, so it's free roaming, so it doesn't really need that support. Healer wise, this is like I think the most interesting part of the meta that has not been solved from the last 2 weeks is Rapier. It still doesn't feel very good because your what do you call it? I am forgetting my Rapier perk name. Your repost just doesn't work. Don't mind the bleed build tree of just trolling people, but three posts like literally if you use that ability and it's not a 1v1 you will just kill yourself, so it's just awful. And then all your other perks are like conditional getaways, so it's just not very good. And if you view Rapier as like your main thing that's good about at this point is Flush A, because evade is like conditional on dodging a hit you get the bonuses, then at that point Hatchet just does the same thing but better, because social distancing, and you also have Defy Death, you have Berserk, which helps you like get haste and live, which is not conditional, and then you also have like some utility. So it's like Hatchet's in theory is just better Rapier. In practice, it feels a little bit more clumsy. I think EU is definitely taking on to that, and they like Hatchet a lot. They tend to run Ice Gauntlets with their healers, but my take is I think Ice Gauntlet is better in more versus more clumpy people, and I think Hatchet is better versus more kill squaddy people, because Hatchet lives better versus the individual kill squads. But if you have people that are in your back line that are able to like dive you with an Ice Gauntlet, like with the Ice Gauntlet, you kind of have to like pre-zone people, if that makes sense. Um, Is my ice gauntlet tree? Yeah, okay. So with the ice gauntlet, like you had to put the pylon down, you kind of had to shower a little bit early, and then you use that shower to like kite around people. But if you're a healer that has to like pull out the shower defensively, you're not actually going to be able to get it off because they'll see you while using the shower. So it's like sort of like a awareness check. You have to like do it early, and it will buy you time, but it's better versus slower comps basically because you could see that more. NA is faster pace, and I don't see this being as good versus really good kill squads, but I could see it being strong. I also think it's a little bit worse versus musket, but still good because you have like less HP with the cleansing tomb, but it's still basically as good as Defy Death. But Defy Death generally will last longer than Cleansing Tomb itself, and if you use Cleansing Tomb versus people that are on you that are melee, it's basically just to delay your life for an extra like half second before you die. Versus this is like 3 seconds, and if they don't have a VG, you could even live with this sometimes because it's like long enough for people to be able to peel for you. And they'll be able to run into a sacred and pop out like a health pot. So yeah, and with all the refreshing, you'll get this ability back up really really fast since it's only an 18-second cooldown, and healers run like max refreshing usually. So it's going to be like a 8 or 9 second cooldown at that point. So you'll be able to get like 2 to 3 of these off per fight if you're getting chased. So I think this like the hatchet is better at living versus kill squads at this point, but Ice Gauntlet is like very very close, and Rapier isn't played as much just because it feels awkward in most circumstances. Like I think people that come back to the game could probably get value out of Rapier. It's just if you have there are circumstances that you more often run into where Hatchet or Ice Gauntlet will feel better than Rapier at this point. I just think healers are leaning to Rapier because it's the weapon they've played since the beginning of the game, and it's sort of like a crutch thing. But they actually like kind of throwing shade here, but they actually warn newer weapons, then they would be able to realize that Hatchet and Ice Gauntlet might be better given the meta where Greatsword can just infinitely close distance versus you, where Ice Gauntlet could be very good if you dropped your cooldowns early, or Hatchet would be able to buy more time and you'd be able to live longer with this, as well as this is also a route which you could apply to people that are chasing you, so it's like another benefit basically to Hatchet. And with Hatchet, I think you'll be able to trade your life better than with Ice Gauntlet. Like Ice Gauntlet's a good setup, but it's not as good. So yeah, there's like this is the probably the most debatable part of the meta, I'd say. Do you run Hatchet? Do you run Ice Gauntlet? Or maybe you just really like your Rapier and you want to run that, then that's probably okay too. But those are all very close. Greatsword's a little bit lower than that, but still very good. Just because of Relentless Freedom, like single-handedly, just makes this like a good weapon. But usually, if you're running something like that, you're going like Relentless Freedom or Relentless Rush, and maybe like Calamity Counter. Like you're just kind of cheesing your way to buying more time to live at that point. So but at the end of the day, it's whatever build you live longest with is best there. Void Gauntlet's lower, partially because AoE healers aren't as slotted anymore. From what I understand in EU, they have healers that are targeted for every specific role. Like they'll have like for a kill squad healer, they'll have 3 single targets. For a point healer, they'll have half them on orbs and half them on sacreds. So at that point, like you don't even really need that kind of healer, and it'll even have like, from what I understand, from what I was told, people are running Void Gauntlet like with Ice Gauntlet as a standalone healer build with just pure focus, which has some utility, but then also has like some decent heals instead of running an AoE healer on EU. And hey, that's usually what people still run an AoE healer, but it's just depending on like your server sort of thing. And I think that it doesn't matter as much, but there is a case for people wanting some better survivability that you might want to drop the life staff, but uh, usually the people that are slotted at AoE healers have done it for a long time, so they're able to live, but it's kind of interesting and that's starting to come up. So that healer meta is definitely shaking up. Probably the most out of any spot. Everywhere else is just like, hey, this great sword hatchet thing exists and might be good, but we don't really know for sure. Uh, and that's just kind of been what EU is playing around with and what NA is like starting to follow, but not really.
Ult-wise, Stoneform's still best on basically everywhere. Defense, I put Vines a little bit higher because if you're able to react to clumps and able to root people in place, you're able to trade up with it very often. And it's a little bit more consistent than Detonate at this point. Detonate's a little bit better on defense. You can make an argument that Stoneform is better than Detonate still on defense, but end of the day on defense, you're just trying to kill more of them than are coming to you because you have respawn advantage. And if you're just trying to trade or trade up, then Vines and Detonate are maybe a little bit better than Stoneform, but I think it's still debatable. Cannon and Ascent just aren't super relevant unless you're a Dex player, in which case Cannon's pretty good. I also dropped Bile completely off this tier list because it has bugs where basically makes it so that you won't receive healing if you use Bile, and I think it makes it so your army might not receive healing. So there's until those bugs get patched, there is no possible way to use Bio and not sabotage your team unless you're, I believe, running the purple version of Bio, in which case it's like you're just giving up so much it doesn't really make sense to run it. So that's why Bile is not on this tier list, because it is currently bugged. And I guess the last disclaimer for this is not including the exploit, which has been going on for a few days at this point, and that people are having fun with, where they can have the passives on other weapons, which just basically makes it so that there are combos that will break the game. Like, if you could use the passives of Hatchet with a life staff, it does not make any sense to use an Ice Gauntlet anywhere. And if you could use something like a BB with the passives of Warhammer where you instantly have all your cooldowns back, then it doesn't make sense to use any other weapon anywhere. But I'm not taking into account in this video because I think for most servers there's like a mutual agreement between companies that that will not be cool, and those people that use that will be reported, and it is a game-breaking bug and not a mechanic. Versus something like the dummies I consider to be a mechanic because it has been known about for months and has not been patched. So at that point, I consider it to be a new world mechanic versus a bug. But that's where I stand on that. Uh, Fire Staff still not getting any value, by the way. Not being seen at all. Void Gauntlet not being seen at all. Spear Rapier not being seen at all. These other Kill Squad builds just completely outclass everything else on this list. So yeah, that's what I have for this tier list. We'll see where it kind of evolves in a few weeks. Imagine the thing that's going to be moving around a lot is Greatsword Hatchet. Greatsword Warhammer also fell off a lot on this list just off experience. If you go the tree that is like modeled like an SNS, SNS turns out to be better because of the bug slash exploit where you can use Plague Strikes very effectively, where you can't use it as effectively on a Greatsword because you can't swap weapons with it because of the stance mechanism. So, and also the Greatsword heavies are very slow, and the SNS heavies are the fastest heavies of any melee weapon in the game. So, yeah, that's basically why that is dropped down a tier there. And that will do it for this one, and I will make another one of these in 2 months. I am sorry there have not been good wars lately, but everyone is on break, and that makes sense. So I will see you guys later.